I just concluded the 6th season of my podcast, Rehash. I co-host it with my friend Hannah, and it's all about internet phenomena that get us all up in arms, only to forget about them within a week. So we rehash them, as they say. This season is about internet subcultures, the stories of how they arrived, thrived, and sometimes died. We talk about emos, weebs, Disney adults, and much, much more. Go check it out.
And the Oscar goes to Quentin Tarantino, Roger Avery for Pulp Fiction.
When Quentin Tarantino went up to accept his award for Best Screenwriting during the 1995 Oscars, he said something everyone had already been thinking.
I think this is probably the only award I'm going to win here tonight, so I was trying to think maybe I should just say a whole lot of stuff right here, right now, just get it all in my system.
It didn't matter how well your film performed at the box office, how many boundaries it pushed, whether critics loved it. Forrest Gump was going to beat your ass. And it's true. Tarantino's sophomore feature, Pulp Fiction, was all of those things. It was the highest-grossing independent film of the time, collecting $200 million worldwide on a budget of $8 million. Critics adored it. Roger Ebert called it the most influential movie of the 1990s, and Owen Gleiberman said that it was nothing less than the reinvention of mainstream American cinema. It had won the Palme d'Or at Cannes, and it swept a number of other award shows as well. But everyone and their mother knew that tonight would not be a success. Nonetheless, when the night ended and Pulp Fiction took home a single award as predicted, people were outraged. When it came to fans, you can only imagine what Twitter would have looked like with all the squawking. Leading up to the awards, Janet Maslin ranked Pulp Fiction the best film of the year and Forrest Gump among the worst. More on that in my Forrest Gump video. William Grimes reflected shortly after that Forrest Gump's sweep represented a vote for traditional Hollywood values as the feel-good film triumphed over the rawer, more experimental Pulp Fiction. The two films felt diametrically opposed. Forrest Gump, about a cognitively impaired man who stumbled upwards through life, was straight-edge, establishment, status quo. Pulp Fiction, which chops and screws its storylines and is all about the crime underworld of LA, rife with drugs, swearing, and graphic violence, was bold and transgressive, a big middle finger to the pearl clutchers of America and to the Hollywood elite. It was everything Forrest Gump wasn't, irony-laden and cynical, where Forrest Gump was unbearably saccharine and sentimental. By all metrics, Pulp Fiction really shouldn't be palatable to most people. In fact, at first glance, it feels like it's trying to shake numbers off its audience with each scene. But something about it spoke to the viewing public of 1994 that, surprisingly, hasn't lasted. Something that's always fascinated me is a once popular, highly competent film that for some reason has rotted in the public eye. Forrest Gump won the Oscars that night. Pulp Fiction lost. And while people were frothing at the mouth for Pulp Fiction back then, neither film, to varying degrees, has withstood the test of time. In the past decade or so, people have begun to turn on Pulp Fiction too. But why? And better yet, is it warranted? Quentin Tarantino was just coming off the wild, unexpected high of his low-budget heist film Reservoir Dogs, when he decided to finally finish the script for the movie he had been wanting to make all along, Pulp Fiction. Reservoir Dogs had found success by the skin of its teeth when Tarantino had the rare opportunity to meet Harvey Keitel, by that point a prolific actor, who saw promise in the young blabbermouth video clerk and decided to give him a chance at securing some funding. Reservoir Dogs shocked, appalled, and thrilled audiences with its gratuitous violence and bountiful profanity, and managed to worm its way into the hearts of critics around the country. While the film was touring the awards circuit, however, Tarantino was in Amsterdam in a one-room apartment cut off from all communication and feverishly completing the final two stories that would comprise Pulp Fiction. The script, born from an idea dreamed up by Tarantino and fellow video clerk Roger Avery, comprised 3 achronological, interconnected stories inspired by crime novels of the 20s and 30s, thus the name Pulp Fiction. There's the first story with 2 hitmen, Jules Winfield and Vincent Vega, who are carrying out the tasks set upon them by their boss, Kingpin Marcellus Wallace, and are confronted with a miraculous, near-death experience. There's the second story, involving Vincent grappling with the dilemma of being asked to entertain Wallace's sexy wife Mia without making an advance on her, a tough ask apparently. And then the third story is about an aging boxer named Butch who refuses an order from Wallace to throw his next fight, attempts to escape town for fear of being killed, but has to turn back at the 11th hour when he discovers that his girlfriend Fabienne left behind a gold watch with significant ancestral importance.
5 long years he wore this watch. Up his ass.
The idea for all 3 stories was basically to take, like, the oldest chestnuts when it comes to crime stories, the oldest stories in the book. Vincent Vega and Marcellus Wallace's wife. The oldest story about, like, the big man's, the guy's got to go out with the big man's wife and don't touch her. You've seen the story a zillion times. The gold watch, the second story. The boxer who was supposed to throw the fight and he doesn't. You've seen it a zillion times, all right? And the third story is not so much a classic story, but almost a big cliche. Like every other Joel Silver movie starts off with a couple hitmen showing up at a place and, shooting somebody and splitting. But after they kill him, we don't leave. We hang out with them all morning long.
The script landed in the hands of Danny DeVito, who had a first look deal with TriStar Pictures. When he gave it over to them, however, they came back and said the script was way too violent, particularly a scene where a young black man named Marvin is accidentally shot in the face. They passed, and so did every other major studio thereafter. The only option was to give it to the now disgraced sex criminal Harvey Weinstein, who was known at this time for taking weird indie films and turning them into gold. They now had the near impossible task of bringing the script to Disney, since Weinstein's production company Miramax had recently merged with them. But when they showed it to CEO Jeffrey Katzenberg, he said, "And for this video, I'm going to be using the first letter of each drug that I mention for the sake of being demonetized." He said, "Easy on the H scene if you can, but that is one of the best scripts I have ever read. Even though you don't need it, I am giving you my blessing." And that was the general sentiment among everyone who would go on to work on Pulp Fiction. Shock at Tarantino's diabolical use of violence, and utter reverence for what was perceived to be his mastery of screenwriting. Tarantino had a list of actors he envisioned for the roles, which drew people like Tim Roth and Harvey Keitel, who had both worked on Reservoir Dogs, Samuel L. Jackson, who wowed everyone with a rather enraged audition after Tarantino threatened to give the role of Jules to someone else, Ving Rhames, who jumped at the opportunity to play Marcellus Wallace because he felt that the character, who endures a brutal essay Gimp scene in the third act of the film, was far different from the roles he was typically offered, and a very young Uma Thurman, who was initially hesitant to sign on because of said Gimp scene. The list was circulated around to producers, and all names were fine except one. Why on God's green earth did Tarantino want John Travolta? Travolta, an icon of the 70s, had suffered critical flop after flop for the last decade, and by 1984, his career was flatlining. But if this gives you a picture of how sought after the film became once Miramax had gotten their hands on it, Weinstein recalled that after threatening to turn down the project if Travolta was to be in it, Tarantino's agent used 2 other buyers, one of whom had attempted to storm into that very meeting to strong-arm Weinstein into accepting Travolta. It worked, and the risk more than paid off, as Travolta approached the character with an idiosyncratic vision, playing him with a great deal of washed-up charisma. Again, in reverence for the project, most of the cast took massive pay cuts to work on this film. Travolta even jokes about paying to be in the movie after the many nights he spent renting his hotel room. But no one took as great a pay cut as Bruce Willis, who plays Butch. Prior to Willis's casting, there were no bankable actors signed on yet. Tarantino was vying for Matt Dillon, but when he waffled too long about the role, like probably a single night, they gave it to a very eager Willis. Filming began in LA, September 1993, on 70 different locations and sets. Tarantino has become known for being one of those rare directors who actually tries to stay within budget, and he really put that to the test with Pulp Fiction. He was committed to keeping it within $8 million, but giving it a high-budget look, which meant he shot it on some very slow Kodak film and used ultra-hot electric lamps to brighten the image and give it that grainy, high-def look. Tarantino diverges from other auteurs we've discussed on this channel, both for his budget-friendly approach, and also because he falls somewhere in the middle between Stanley Kubrick, who demands total and sole control over every component of the production process, and Robert Altman, who leans heavily into the improvisation of his actors and a general sonic messiness. Tarantino was open to insights from his cast about the script, landing on the ending for the film after watching Jackson's fiery audition, and allowing Travolta to curate his character's Euro trash look. When Travolta read the scene where Vincent shoots poor Marvin in the face, He felt that the character's original directions to hit Marvin with a mercy bullet after shooting him accidentally in the neck would actually turn audiences against Vincent if he shot Marvin intentionally at all. So instead, Tarantino acquiesced to his suggestion that the character blasts Marvin away with a single accidental bullet. Tarantino also added in his own random tidbits of dialogue that do a lot of subtle legwork in humanizing the characters. Like this scene where Fabienne muses about her fantasy of having a potbelly.
If I had one, I'd wear a t-shirt 2 sizes too small to accentuate it.
While you want to shake the character sometimes for her obliviousness, it's tender moments like this that open up a soft spot for her, both from the audience and from Butch, so that when she does something as stupid as leaving his watch behind, you, like Butch, can't help but forgive her. She's actually a character I used to hate, but have come to adore with later viewings. There was a lot of attention to detail when it came to the character's drug use. When he was writing the script, Tarantino reached out to an old acting school friend and former H addict who could give him as authentic a read as possible. Travolta himself spent time hanging out with H addicts to execute a believable H high during his scene with Thurman. Actually, while it's impossible for most audiences to tell, along with Mia, between H and C, Tarantino went to the lengths to distinguish between regular baggies, which contain C, and balloon baggies, which contain H. When Vincent purchases the drug, he's told by his dealer that there are no balloon baggies left, and so Mia, an addict herself, makes the mistake like anyone would of thinking it's C. Details. Weinstein was a festival circuit hound. Known now for bullying and coercing his way through his personal affairs, the same he did in business, and especially when it came to awards. His philosophy about award shows, and especially the Oscars, was that they breathed a second life into the film in terms of box office sales. To lock this down for Pulp Fiction, he employed an Iron Curtain strategy, where he would screen it at a festival and then bar anyone else from seeing it until the next festival. What this did was generate hype and intrigue. It worked. And like the cast, people were in total reverence for the very thing that won Tarantino his Oscar, the screenplay, which stood in direct opposition to the formulaic Hollywood movies that the Oscars typically favor. Roger Ebert even said that Pulp Fiction was so well written that you want to rub noses in it. The noses of those zombie writers who take screenwriting classes that teach them the formulas for hit films. And when Harvey Keitel asked Tarantino how he came to write such a marvelous script, Tarantino said, "I watch movies."
It's your movie. It's playing. The shot where she gets hit in the heart with the adrenaline shot.
Yeah.
Someone passes out, is having a seizure. What did you think?
This movie works. It's like shit, this shit's like too intense for human beings. It's like, hey, that can stop people's heart, man. That's cinema. This is a movie.
One thing to know about Tarantino, and something you definitely know if you're in any film circles online, or online at all really, is that Quentin Tarantino likes movies. Like, a lot. With all the videos circulating around the ether of him babbling at warp speed about such and such film from such and such time that you just need to watch, and with that searing observation from Fiona Apple about having to endure Tarantino's coked up rants from her time dating Paul Thomas Anderson.
I think maybe this is the time of your life to climb Mount Everest.
Tarantino has earned his title as the film bro to end all film bros. After all, he got his start while working as a video clerk with much more access to films than the regular person at the time. And this incessant know-it-all film bro persona definitely bleeds into the way Tarantino makes films. What kind of films does a film fanatic make? Well, Tarantino's films always seem to be pointing towards his knowledge of film. Jackie Brown is a 90s installment to the blaxploitation genre of the 1970s. Kill Bill is Tarantino's take on the martial arts and exploitation films of that same decade. Django is a revisionist ode to the spaghetti westerns of the 60s, and Reservoir Dogs has been accused of directly ripping off Ringo Lam's 1987 Hong Kong action film City on Fire. And while most directors come into the job with a degree of love for cinema, many being film critics, historians, or scholars themselves, Tarantino dissenters have been quick to draw a line between him and the others. For example, in a blistering takedown of Pulp Fiction, Pat Dowell compares Tarantino to Jean-Luc Godard. Godard borrowed with a difference: to comment, to satirize, to discredit, to examine, to open other possibilities. Tarantino borrows to create cultural cul-de-sacs, places of intellectual safety and anesthesia, and his thrust is basically conservative. He is first and foremost an ingenious curator, displaying his collection of cultural trivia. The line being that Godard displays a depth of cultural understanding in his films and transforms that into something new, whereas Tarantino skates across a vast range of films and genres and images without ever really penetrating the surface. Kind of like how Forrest Gump does with history. And that has proven to be lucrative, to the chagrin of many critics. One critic, Gary Groth, called Tarantino the perfect shill for both the passive ideology of spectatorship that the information age requires and for the product its leading industry manufactures. Dowell says that Tarantino is the first poet to give himself completely to the consumer age. He is, in Dowell's words, the distillation of Hollywood's eternal pledge that it's only a movie, and a fitting hero for the centennial of commercial cinema. Dowell says that at the heart of Tarantino's films is the exhilaration of watching a gifted fetishist arrange the useless objects of his obsession. It's like looking into the abyss and longing to fall into the restful emptiness. Critic Anthony Lane also called Tarantino a chronic fetishist, and literary critic James Wood said that his work is stripped of any politics, metaphysics, or moral interest. Harsh words, but are they true? At least when it comes to Pulp Fiction. Tarantino certainly doesn't have any real answers when asked about the film's moral core. When he's asked about its themes, he just references the fact that he simply wanted to make an omnibus movie, the three separate story movie. And when he went up to accept his award at Cannes and a woman screamed that Pulp Fiction was shit, he threw up a giddy middle finger before proclaiming into the mic,
"The one movie that brought them all together. I kind of make movies that kind of split people apart."
Pulp Fiction has an iconic soundtrack, one that essentially raised me. Tarantino really displays his prowess with a good needle drop here. Much like Reservoir Dogs, he cuts through the brutality of a moment with a catchy song that inherently lifts the audience's spirits and softens the blow of what they've just watched or are about to watch. As scholar Lisa Coulthard observes, this delimiting use of pop music in Tarantino's films thus defines and transforms physical brutality so that it is emphasized as a vectorized point of enjoyment, a perfect moment of violence akin to the number in a musical film or the money shot in, let's call it, pornography. These are highly pleasurable moments. Actually, you can derive pleasure from many elements of Pulp Fiction. It's needle drops, it's pop culture references, whether it's Jules and Vincent talking about the European version of a McDonald's burger, or the fictional diner that Vince and Mia go to, which is chock full of paraphernalia from Eisenhower's America, Marilyn, Elvis, Douglas Sirk, or even a throwaway joke about Fonzie from Happy Days. Or if it's Easter eggs about the actors' own filmographies, like John Travolta in Saturday Night Fever, or Christopher Walken in The Deer Hunter. You can also get pleasure from Pulp Fiction's quotability. Like, if you can so much as breathe, you've heard at least one of these lines repeated back to you at some point in your life.
Royale with cheese. This is a tasty burger. That's pride.
You can just shut the fuck up for a minute. Comfortably share silence.
Be back before you can say blueberry pie.
Blueberry pie.
Shit, Negro. That's all you had to say.
Oh man, I shot Marvin in the face.
Why the f you do that?
Each scene is punctuated with lines of dialogue that can be easily extracted from their context because the context hardly exists in the first place. It's easy to quote Pulp Fiction, but it's tough to pin down exactly what it's trying to say.
Best everybody they could take a stab at telling the story of the movie.
Telling this story? No.
No way.
Absolutely not.
No way.
Yeah, few people from Pulp Fiction's large ensemble cast, nor its production, not even Tarantino, has been willing to discuss the themes of the film. For example, when discussing the exchange between Jules and Vincent as they ponder the veracity of a story they heard about Marcellus throwing a guy off a balcony for giving Mia a foot rub, Tarantino references another filmmaker and screenwriter, John Cassavetes, as the inspiration for this scene. Not for its contents, but for its structure. The way they talk around what they're doing. I was like, can I get that kind of thing going on the page? When talking about where the idea for the film came from, like we saw, it's not about any sort of cultural or moral or philosophical observation, but about different forms of media he likes. So back to the question of why a movie as unpalatable as Pulp Fiction could win the hearts of so many. Perhaps it's because it's not so different from Forrest Gump at all. It hits all the dopamine points of an empty cultural reference without needing to justify itself beyond that. It allows its characters to, in Dowell's words, succeed and fail on a relatively random basis that has little to do with their actions. For Dowell, a character like Vincent evading death and then meeting it again in the bathroom, or Jules and Vincent dodging every bullet that Alexis Arquette's character shoots at them, is no different than Forrest becoming a national sensation for running for no reason at all. What makes Pulp Fiction even worse for its critics is how self-conscious the movie is. That the movie seems all too aware of its own perceived lack of depth.
And that, my friends, is postmodernism. I can already hear you groaning, and believe me, I am groaning too. Whenever this word pops up in our research, I do an audible sigh, because I know that I once again have to risk being insufferable for the sake of art and at great expense to myself. I'm pretty sure I shed about 100 subscribers every time the word postmodern comes out of my mouth, and it comes out a lot, but there's no getting around this one.
Okay, so there's modernism, blah blah, it's all about universal reason, breaking from tradition, individualism, objectivity, expression. Postmodernism breaks from this, or at least falls from the modernist tree, and questions the idea of truth and objectivity, of sincerity and progress, and what we get from that is art that is, well, very aware of itself. Doesn't offer a singular truth, very artificial. Rather than pulling you in, it pushes you away. So, Pulp Fiction may just be the postmodern film.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I break your concentration?
The name itself is just a reference, referring not to the goings-on of the film, but the structure that holds it together. It has multiple timelines and several different POVs, tossing into question the concept of time with its non-linear narrative structure. It coolly glosses past any emotional flashpoints, using music to pull you right out of them. It doesn't let you get attached to anyone in particular. You spent most of this movie with Vincent, and you're sad when he's killed, but it happens from the POV of another character who you've also spent time with, and who Vincent is trying to kill. And it happens in a bathroom. There's nothing for your emotions to latch onto. The movie just moves right along. And then boom, Vincent is on our screens again as we jump back in time. Like Forrest Gump, Pulp Fiction makes a collage, a pastiche of Americana, but never tells us why.
This coolness, all style and no substance, and not giving a damn about it, was alienating to some.
Critic Derek Malcolm, for example, found Pulp Fiction to be a passionless movie, and said that it can seem both empty and retrograde, which, I'm afraid, may fit our present times all too well. Anthony Lane miffed that Tarantino is an artist mad for affect, terrified that his audience may be bored or moved, the same thing as far as he's concerned. And Dowell actually recalls that iconic song at the end of Nashville, It Don't Bother Me, and says that Pulp Fiction has an I don't care sensibility that seems synonymous with postmodernism, in a bad way.
And yes, Pulp Fiction often seems deeply unconcerned with morals of any kind.
Vincent and his dealer throw Mia's body about as if it were a bag of groceries. His concern for her overdose stems more from a fear for his own life rather than it does out of concern for hers. Thieves Pumpkin and Honey Bunny get off scot-free after terrorizing a diner full of people, and apparently having gotten away with many robberies before this, purely because they caught Jules in the middle of his enlightenment. Vince blasts away the head of a young black boy, and his death becomes the subject of an extended joke. Actually, blackness in Pulp Fiction, as it is in most of Tarantino's films, is a fraught subject. Black characters feature largely in his films, often taking center stage, but Tarantino also takes great liberties in using racist language, most notably the N-word. So much so that he now has a decades-long beef with Spike Lee, who, after watching Jackie Brown, remarked, "Quentin is infatuated with that word. What does he want to be made, an honorary black man?" Lee's criticism came again after the 2013 release of Django Unchained, a revenge movie about a black man who has been freed from enslavement, which has an incredibly liberal use of the N-word throughout. But his most controversial use of the word is in Pulp Fiction, when Tarantino makes a cameo as a hard-done-by friend of Jules named Jimmy, who's incredulous at the idea of Marvin's body being hidden in the pristine home that he and his wife Bonnie share. When confronted with this request, Jimmy embarks on a rant that has Tarantino say the N-word not 1, but 4 times in a single short scene. Tarantino has defended his use of the word with this argument: "I feel the N-word is one of the most volatile words in the English language, and anytime anyone gives a word that much power, I think everybody should be shouting it from the rooftops to take that power away." but I don't really think that's why he's using it.
We don't know Jimmy up until this point, so the word coming out of his mouth is arguably much more jarring and random than, say, it coming out of slave owner Calvin Candy's mouth in Django. I guess Jimmy is a former criminal himself, and by that, an extension of the low-level criminals in Reservoir Dogs who also use this word freely. But ultimately, the scene is not about race. Marvin's identity is never brought up before this. So the goal is not to soften the power of the word, it's to shock us, to pull us right out of the scene, calling to the material of the movie, the meta-ness of Tarantino being here and saying such a thing, than it is some commentary about Marvin's race. With each new utterance of this word, Marvin is quickly reduced from the scared young guy who got in over his head that we've come to know, to nothing but a carcass. And not only that, a racialized one, a burden to everyone in the scene. Scholar Cynthia Young draws a parallel between this objectifying of Marvin, and by extension the other black characters, and the film's I don't care sensibility. She says that fans of the film get so wrapped up in analyzing every little genius detail of its surface, its cinematography and references and profanities, that they ignore its larger ideological implications, which for her pertain to race. She says, through the pairing of black and white bodies, Pulp Fiction attempts to write out the brutal institutionalization of white male privilege by depicting race and culture as wholly constructed, interchangeable, and exchangeable commodities circulating in the fatally cool environs of postmodern LA. Black bodies, like Marvin's, in a sense become commodities floating on the surface of Pulp Fiction's pastiche, making the film cast just as inhumane a gaze upon them as it does to everything else. And in doing so, black people in LA and their struggles become collateral damage for the postmodern shrug. I loved Pulp Fiction as a teenager. It introduced me to new music, it taught me a lot of useful things like not to snort H. I got that special bob. It was very influential for me, and I think that's the role it plays in the lives of many young people. It's kind of like a gateway movie for cinema, the access point for art films of every kind. Much of that is thanks to Tarantino's clear inspirations and homages. But for many reasons, this is also why people started to turn on the film. It became rudimentary, a movie for know-it-alls who think cinema begins and ends with Pulp Fiction, who think it invented the many genres and forms and images it takes from. I think any filmic entry point is a good thing. But when that entry point is perceived as an empty pastiche of other movies, with less heart, then some may think that kids aren't getting the full picture they deserve. It's got a cynical worldview that speaks to disaffected young people and makes them feel cool, but it sacrifices something in doing so, namely the humanity of some of its marginalized characters. But is Pulp Fiction totally rotten? Or is it, like Jules and Vincent, worth saving? Themeless as it may appear, this is a movie about second chances, redemption. Well, revenge and redemption. Revenge is the tissue that connects all the storylines. One person hurts another, that person tries to get back at them, and so on and so forth. Redemption is the emotional core, and much of that emotion comes through Jules, a black character who Tarantino does choose to bestow a great deal of complexity. Jules is a hardened hitman who revels in his killings with bombastic sermons about vengeance, but he isn't cold-blooded. He's actually the first to vocalize this idea of redemption when his life is spared in that very early scene, and from then on starts to ponder why he was spared and what his path is as a newly redeemed man. This is what leads him to spare the thieves. Actually, many characters are spared in this film. Mia's life is spared by Vincent's instinct for self-preservation, Fabienne is spared by Butch's love towards her, Butch spares Marcellus Wallace, who just moments before he wanted to kill, and in exchange, Marcellus spares Butch. The humor of Pulp Fiction is in the constant push and pull between mundanity and spontaneous eruptions of violence. One moment, the characters will be having a humdrum conversation about McDonald's or the ethics of a foot rub, and the next they'll be mercilessly blasting people away with a handgun. Or chatting over brunch and sharing a kiss before jumping on the table, wielding a handgun, and screaming profanities at other diners. Or narrowly escaping a sadomasochistic den of terror and then asking their girlfriend what she ate for breakfast. And this is where Pulp Fiction's humanity peeks through. Its characters belong to a cold underworld where bloodshed is commonplace, but they're also regular folk who dither over the tribulations of everyday life.
And because of that, the movie views them as worthy of saving. Those very same miracles that critics lambasted the film for are the same ones that scholars Todd Davis and Kenneth Womack think save it from its cynicism. They say, beyond the hazy lens of Tarantino's deliberately dark gangland tableau, beyond the greed, drugs, and gun blasts, Pulp Fiction prefers a fictional universe where miracles still happen, where love can still make a difference. I'm sure postmodernism would not appreciate my corny-ass attempt to assign meaning to it, but believe it or not, there is also meaning to non-meaning. The proof is in the pudding, the medium is the message, whatever. Pulp Fiction's cool, glassy surface is the ultimate meaning. When asked on Joe Rogan where his flair for references comes from, Tarantino said this.
The generation before us that lived through the 60s, they had the 60s. They had the accoutrement in the 60s. They had all that 60s music. And they looked down on the generation that grew up in the 60s, in the 70s. So, you didn't have any of that shit. You didn't have the music that we had. Well, maybe we didn't have the music you had. We had our music. But what we did have is we had television. We had the Saturday morning cartoons that we dug. We had Schoolhouse Rock. We had all the TV shows we liked. We had Speed Racer. We had all these kind of things. And they meant something to us. Kids back then, who if their parents didn't let them watch TV at a certain point, well, the parents might have actually had the best intentions, but they were actually robbing their children of the pop cultural glue that's going to tie them to their generation when they get older. Tarantino communicates exclusively through references, both in real life and in his movies. And Todd and Womack argue that references can be, in some cases, community building. They say, the witty repartee that many critics praise as the film's singular strength in fact affords its audience with a pop cultural inroad into Tarantino's fictive world, a universe rendered even more tangible through its myriad representations of shared cultural ephemera, such as the ethics of $5 milkshakes and the French translations of McDonald's fare that oddly but inevitably lead to larger ontological discussions concerning the existence of God and the veracity of miracles. A reference is a connection between Tarantino and his characters and the audience who understands them. These references were the language of Gen X especially, who were the first to be entirely native to mass media. So Tarantino uses pop culture references to draw his audience in and unite them, and then from there opens the gates to larger philosophical conversations. And this is why his movie, while it has its dissenters, was such a sea change in the world of American filmmaking. It managed to speak the language of its generation while also giving a middle finger to the establishment, while also sneaking its way into the establishment and making a lot of money. In his retrospective of the 1995 Oscars, Adam Naiman dubbed Tarantino as the most liberated commercial filmmaker in America, beholden to no franchises or pre-existing intellectual properties, the center of his own sprawling cinematic universe. And I'd say that's definitely true. But his legacy as a filmmaker depends entirely on how he uses that liberation, and just exactly what and who he's giving that finger to. There are provocateurs like Tarantino who provoke sometimes just to shock us. And then there are provocateurs like Paul Verhoeven who have made it their life's mission to lift the curtain on society and teach us something new about ourselves that we may not have wanted to know. My series, Taboo on Screen, is about filmmakers like Verhoeven, who explore the ugly, morally gray, and taboo aspects of humanity, and in doing so, attempt to crack open our worldviews, successfully or not. In Taboo on Screen, we look at films that challenge and sometimes offend our sensibilities, covering difficult topics like whether we should get rid of sex scenes, the films of Todd Solondz, Brooke Shields and the controversy around Pretty Baby, and the wacky world of John Waters. Taboo on Screen is just one of a whole host of prestige original series on Nebula, made by some of your favorite creators. We're taking the art of video making to a whole other level and providing a wide range of thoughtful content. You can think of Nebula like Netflix for people who love cultural commentary, and an impossibly wide range of other subjects as well. Nebula is a streaming service that's creator-founded and creator-led, which means we get a ton of creative control over the videos we make. Right now, you can see Taboo on Screen, as well as all my past videos, ad-free on Nebula, and you can even watch Nebula videos offline with their app.
If you like my videos, and if you like Taboo on Screen, then you'll definitely love Unrated, a Nebula original series by Maggie Mae Fish, where she dives into the history of sex and sexuality on the big screen. You can also find Be Kind Rewind on Nebula, and many of my other favorite creators like Thomas Flight and Not Just Bikes. If you're interested in watching some really amazing original content, you can sign up using the link below, and you can support me directly and get Nebula for a 40% off annual plans. Then there's lifetime memberships, which cost $300 and last you forever. Just you, me, and eternity, baby. So go to nebula.tv/broedeChanel or click the link in the description for 40% off right now. Special thank you to Syed Hassan, Malpertui, Morgan, Cooper Stimson, Nadia C., Nick, Jenny Eller, J. Frost McFinnigan, Gabriel M., The Wiz Daniel, Edward Yu, Andrew Nguyen, Carolyn Stowe, Connor O'Keefe, Gavin Borden, Sharma, Smith, Daniel Sardunas, Jenya, Ryan Blythe, Maya Kamaeva, Naomi Nakagawa, Burrow Fiddle, Scott Barnett, Julia Campana, Mr. Allen, Luis Eduardo Taroba, Alexis, Navis Bullock, Carrie Gavin, RSS, Fridtjof Holstrom, Alex Short, and Kelly Wolf for supporting this channel.